So like I, so now everything's recording. But like Paul said, I'm Taylor. I'm currently doing my master's at Stockton University in American Studies. I recently graduated from there with my bachelor's in literature. And so today I'll talk a little bit about the Lenape and focusing more on the Tuckerton and sort of Southern Ocean County into Atlantic County area. Um, while I share my presentation, I'll turn my camera off. There'll be a few natural breaks in the presentation. At that point, I'll turn my camera back on. If anyone wants to put any questions in the chat while I'm presenting during those breaks, then I'll answer them. And then at the end, we'll do a formal Q&A. Okay, can everybody see this presentation now?
Yep, looks great, Taylor.
All right. Okay, so first I'd like to start off by reading a land acknowledgement statement from the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation Headquarters website. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenape, called Lenape Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Teminend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. And so before we move on, I'd like to explain why this statement's important. It reminds us that the land that we zoom from, the land we talk about today, it's hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of years of history that's led up to now. It prompts us to take a moment to appreciate this land and the indigenous people whose land we live on. And this type of reflection is always relevant, but it seems even more relevant, especially since we just recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. Northwestern University discusses these declarations on their website, and they had a really interesting perspective that they shared. They said that land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or a historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation, end quote. And so I just wanted to start off with this statement just to get us in that mindset that we are really talking about the Lenape and history, but it's not just in the past. It's continuous, it's past, present, and future. And so today's presentation is a little bit of an outline just to give you an idea of what to expect. And so with that, I'll go over a bit about the midden or the clamshell mound located in Tuckerton. Then I'll talk about the archaeological site known as the Pinella site, which is what's today known as the Atlantis Golf Course, borderline between Tuckerton and Little Egg Harbor. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation, their headquarters in Bridgeton, New Jersey, and how to learn more on their website, followed by, of course, the Q&A interspersed throughout, and then more so at the end. And so first, here's a photograph of the midden or the clamshell mound. This one was taken by me earlier this spring. And to give you an idea, the Tuckerton midden is located right off of Great Bay Boulevard. And so first, rewind a little bit and we'll talk a little bit about what a midden is. So a midden is a refuse pile or a garbage heap As an archaeological feature, they typically contain lots of artifacts within one localized space. This can include anything from discarded food scraps, broken tools, any other sorts of utilitarian items that have become unusable, things that people would, throw out, essentially a landfill. ThoughtCo, there's an article from 2019 that they published, and the author K. Christ Hurst notes that the word midden is derived from the Danish word kokenmatting or kitchen mound. I definitely did not pronounce that right, so I apologize for that, but it's spelled over here. And so middens are important in archaeology because they reveal cultural behaviors, daily practices, rituals, and even like the status and the wealth groups. You can learn a lot about society by the materials that they use every day and what they throw out. Um, Middens can indicate a familial or community presence depending on the size, whether it's something more localized or something that the larger community would use. And they're also useful because the items found within these middens can be radiocarbon dated to determine how old the group who lived there was. And so on the left-hand side, there's an aerial view of the checkered and clamshell mound photograph that I found online. That'll be from a video that I'll show soon. And so about this specific midden, this clamshell mound, like I've mentioned a few times previously, it's in Tuckerton, New Jersey, off of Great Bay Boulevard, or more known as Seven Bridges Road. It's part of the Great Bay Wildlife Management Area, which is also part of the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so it's considered to be the clamming work site to the base camp and covered at the nearby Pinellas site, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's the one that today would be known as the Atlantis Golf Course. This place was also excavated in the 1970s. And in this area, there's a mix of hardshell clams and oyster shells. And the mound itself is currently about 9 feet high and 80 feet long. Lots of different articles date it differently, but typically the assumption is that this can date back up to thousands of years and that it's something that's been continuously used. And the mound itself, if you can notice here, you'll see that there's a lot of cedar trees around it. That's because of the refuse that was piled in that one area, the natural decomposition of, clams and oysters, left over. Those actually impact the quality of the soil. And so you'll notice in the video later on that there's a concentration of cedar trees there, and the whole rest of the salt marsh is relatively marshy. And so now I'm going to mute myself. And so if Caitlin can share her screen so that she could play the video, I'm going to try to do it first on here, but I've been having some bandwidth issues. So let's see. Seems like it's buffering a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop share and I'm going to mute my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin.
Okay, no problem, Taylor. Let me share. Oh, hold on. Okay.
And so I'll do a little bit of a voiceover. The video itself doesn't have any audio, but this is some drone footage that was taken within the past couple of years. And this is the clam midden located off of Great Bay Boulevard. You can see the concentration of cedar trees over here. It looks like this was taken more in the wintertime. You can see it's a little bit frosty out. But we'll watch the first couple of minutes of this just to give you more of an idea of what we're talking about if you haven't gotten a chance to see it for yourself. And so here's Seven Bridges Road. It'll pan around the entire landscape, and then it'll head back towards the midden. And here it's panning back towards the midden. It'll get a little bit closer. And then once it gets to about the 4-minute mark, we'll pause and we'll turn it back to the presentation itself. Here you can see it's getting a little closer. You can get a better idea visually of what the midden looks like. And so you can see it's about 80 feet long, like I said before, and about 9 feet high. It's a little bit tricky to notice at first. And keep in mind that this is what the midden looks like nowadays, because once we go back to the presentation, I'll show some photographs of what it looked like about 100 years ago. Okay, and that's good. Thank you. All right, I'm going to switch back to my screen. And so, let's see. One moment. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, and now I'm going to go back into presentation mode. Okay, I'm going to skip through the first couple of slides again. Okay, almost there. And so after this, one more, and then we'll be back to where we left off. Okay, so here's a photo that was taken from Francis Jordan's Aboriginal fishing stations on the coast of the Middle Atlantic states. So this was a book that was published around 1901. I couldn't find the copy itself online, although there are some reproductions of it that are selling on Amazon, like reprints. But the caption for the photograph from the book itself says, "Remains of pile dwelling village and marsh near Tuckerton, New Jersey, center of the shell mound on the east side." And so Obviously, the clarity is a little bit different considering it was 1901, but it shows how some of the trees are different. Some of them might even be the same trees that were there then, but it just gives you an idea of what the midden looked like about 100 years ago, actually about 120 years ago. And so on the next slide, here's another photograph of the same midden. And this is from The Lure of Long Beach by George Somerville. This was published in 1914, and it was published by the Long Beach Trade. And so you can sort of see, again, a little blurry, but the marsh itself never really changes much. But the midden itself has definitely decreased in size over the years. And so here's a little bit about legends and lore near the midden. I guess inspired by the legends and lore phrase that the seaport's utilizing for their tours that are coming soon. But there's been some sort of historical, I guess, interest in the midden, of course, but there's a lot of legends, a lot of misconceptions, and a lot of inaccuracies that sort of surround the area. There was an article that was written by a Tuckerton resident, Steve Dodson, in about the late 70s. And he titled it Tuckerton's Race of Giant Men, an Historical Mystery. And that can be found on the Tuckerton Historical Society's website. It's short, maybe about 10 pages or less, and it details Dodson's experiences when he read this 1940 book. The title is Tides of Time. The book itself talks about these two twin brothers, Art and Alf Gilson, and how they found human remains that they said were over 7 feet tall on their farm site in Tuckerton. Dodson writes that today this would be considered the harbor town development in Mystic Island, just to give you a more modern idea of where that might be. So this is in the late 19th century that the Gilson brothers are existing. And Dodson then becomes really interested in this tale. Is there truth to it? And so he ends up working with descendants of the Gilson brothers at an acme, he says. And he then starts to write this series of letters between himself and all sorts of museum and archaeological professionals throughout the New Jersey area, the New York metropolitan area, and into Philly. And he's trying to see, first off, if anyone has any information about this. He writes to people at Rutgers as well. And then also to see if there, besides any records, it's just if there's any validity to this tale. The story itself has largely been disproven. A lot of it, when you think about the time, the mid to late 1800s, the Gilson brothers themselves were what they kind of called amateur archaeologists. In terms of like the historical and the social context, there's a lot of interest with Darwinism and a lot of rhetoric that's going around that is later proven to be very like shocking and something that would be like ridiculous by today's standards. But at the time, people were very interested in this idea of studying sociology and all of these forms of ideas, and so they are more likely to believe things. At this time, armchair ethnography also becomes popular. And what that means is that it tends to be amateur people who are interested in history and telling and sharing other people's stories. But their best practices for the late 1800s certainly are not up to today's standards in terms of letting people tell their own stories and making sure that we're authentic to people themselves, and their own stories that they're willing to share with others. And so back to the Gilson brothers, their stories largely prove false. The tale that they kind of spin, whether they believe it, whether the evidence that they found is fabricated, or whether they truly believe that these are human remains. They say that these giant skeletons had belonged to indigenous people who predated the Lenni Lenape. Later, then the story shifts and it says that these people coexisted with the Lenni Lenape, and it's sort of rooted in a lot of um, harsh misbeliefs at the time. It's very sensationalized, very glorified, over glorified, and they mention that they think that the people who the skeletons belong to were murdered by the Lana Lenape, and they talk about these injuries inflicted on the skeletons that were testament to a massacre. Of course, this connects to like this long history of colonialism with particularly like these immigrants, particularly white immigrants, believing these outlandish things about the people who were here first. So a lot of that's been disproven. But on the photo on the right, there's Alf and Art Gilson themselves. And so Dodson is one of these people in the 70s that is starting to, kind of really delve into this local history. As a Tuckerton resident, he's very much interested in, whether this is true, because at the time there's excavation sites going on in the area, which again, I'll talk about in the next section. But before I get to the Pinilla site, if anybody has any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer them, talking about the middens or talking about some of the legends of the area that I kind of delved into. If not, I'll pause, I'll give a minute or so, and then I'll jump to the next part.
Okay, so if you have a question for Taylor so far, you can put it in the chat or take yourself off mute if you'd like to. We'll give a few seconds if you're typing. All right, I don't see anything coming through, Taylor, so I think it's safe to have you keep going.
All right, so I'll go share screen again. Okay, and now I'll talk a little bit about the Pinella site at the Atlantis Golf Course. Over here, this is an image that's at the Tuckerton Seaport. That is a photograph of the Pinella site. And there's some students, and it's a collaborative effort led by professors, which we'll talk about in a little bit, conducting their excavation. And so once the next slide loads, let's see. Seems like it's taking a minute to load. So let me see if I stop sharing, I go back into it. That might be. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go back into it now. Let's see if this time. Can everybody see it? I'm sharing it this time through the web page of my PowerPoint. Apologize if that's a little distracting. It seems like it's working a little bit better though. So a little bit of background on the Pinilla site. It was excavated from about 1973 to 1975, and it was later revisited in 2001 over at Tuckerton. People say Tuckerton, Little Egg Harbor, sort of where the lines blur between the municipalities. But it's over off of Great Bay Boulevard. And the site itself was excavated in partnership between the then Richard Stockton State College, today known as Stockton University, and the Archaeology Society of New Jersey. And so the Tucker and Seaport Museum's collection contains photographs of the dig and information shared by a local resident, Mr. Carl Bott. And the archives note that over 100 5-foot squares were excavated at the Pinella site, and it located areas used as storage pits, refuse pits, and indications of homes. The site's considered a base camp to the nearby shell mound, and it's tied to indigenous groups that predate the Lenape in this area. And so on to the next slide. Here you can see that there's some figures from an article called Collections, Mortality and Immortality, a case study of aging museum collections through faunal analysis from the Pinella site in Ocean County, New Jersey. This was published about 6 years ago in the Journal of Middle Atlantic Archaeology, written by Devin Lee Ward and Gregory Dennis Latazani, I'm sorry. And so you can see there's a couple of figures. The one on the left, the first one, depicts a couple of maps showing the location of the Pinella site, kind of in relation to the rest of Tuckerton. Then the second figure shows these maps with the 73, 74 excavation sites at Pinella. And so they're all plotted along there. And then the third figure talks about some of the work in 1975 with this site. And so the next slide shows another picture from the Tuckerton Seaport. This one taken from the big site. You can see it's from about 1975, and it's kind of showing more about what they were finding there. And so next, a little bit from Stockton University Special Collections. That's their archives. And so these are all from the same newspaper, but I just cropped out certain portions so that they were a little bit more easy to view. But this was the Stockton Chronicle, a student publication from the time. This edition is from May of 1975, and it talks about the Pinella site. And the Pinella site itself is named after the people at the time who owned that site. They were the Pinella family. That's where that name comes from, pre the Atlantis Golf Course. And so the article itself says, Soon's Dig, a glimpse into the short past. And so it explains how this was an effort by an archaeology field methods group of students, about 28 or so, led by an adjunct professor at Stockton. And supposedly they ended up finding over 70 different features, including, like I said before, these refuse pits, lots and lots of hearths. And so what I really thought was very interesting about this article is when the professor notes that the site is important because of its excellent preservation. Because the oysters and clamshells neutralize the soil, the foodstuffs such as deer, bird, and turtle are well preserved. And this enables us to establish the diets of these prehistoric inhabitants. And so that's what's really interesting about Middens is that you can learn a lot more about the people who lived here. You can learn more about their daily existence. And so this is what people are now finding through these excavation sites. And so moving on from that, I'll talk a little bit about the Nanticoke Lenape tribal nation itself. And it may seem a bit of a misnomer for this presentation because it focuses on the Lenape tribal nation, but for the most part, these archaeological sites are delving into indigenous groups who predate the Lenape. However, this is both their land, and so it's very relevant when discussing the area to talk about the Lenape and older groups as well. So the Nanticoke Lenape tribal nation, a lot of people sometimes have misconceptions on how it's pronounced, but it's Lenai with a long I, and then Lenape. People sometimes try to suggest a Lake Lenape, but that's, again, a different pronunciation. That's not the correct one. from the tribal website. And so the tribal headquarters is in Bridgeton, New Jersey, over in Cumberland County in the western half of the state. They are a constitutional government. So they have their own rules and whatnot. And they have these community services that are administered through tribally controlled 501c3. So a nonprofit, it's got social services, community development, and the organization itself is known as the Nanticoke, Lenape Indians of New Jersey. And so moving on to a little bit of the constitutional government. This is taken directly from the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation website. And so it states that the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation is constitutionally organized, self-governing, inherently sovereign American Indian nation. And so that's important to recognize is that they have members that are enrolled in this tribal nation have dual citizenship. And so they're a member nation of the Confederation of Sovereign Nanticoke Lenape Tribes. It's an intertribal union and a few other tribes in the area, mostly located in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, in that region. And so they're all historically and genealogically interrelated. It's recognized by the state of New Jersey. And it talks about how they're a voting member nation of the National Congress of American Indians, which is our oldest and largest organization of American Indian tribes. So it's really important when we're looking into the past that we don't get caught up in the past, which sounds kind of confusing. But essentially, when we're learning about the past, we're learning about people, we're learning about people's families. And so it's important to recognize that history is continuous, that you can't look at the past without considering the present and also considering the future. What are the ramifications of, this research that you bring to light, or what's the impact that sharing this information has on local communities and beyond that? And more importantly, how can you conduct research and how can you learn things and go about that in a respectful manner? And so with anything related to Indigenous peoples, it's always best to not seek out presenters. I'm only one presenter, but more importantly, first and foremost, go to the tribal nations website themselves. These are the people who, this is their history, this is their ancestry, and so they're still active today. They're active participants in the community. They host both open and closed practice gatherings. Of course, with COVID, that's shifted in the past year or two. But their website is the nlltribe.com. And this banner is taken from the website and it says, "We are still here." And I think that's important to consider, that this group is still here. We talk about them, we don't talk about them in the past tense, that we, remember that as we go forward. Kind of going hand in hand with that land acknowledgement statement, with being mindful of, where we tread when we engage with history and engage with others' communities. And so in terms of other recommended works, of course, there's all sorts of works throughout the presentation. But something that popped up a lot was Looking Beneath the Surface, The Story of Archaeology in New Jersey by R. Allen Mounier, published in 2003. I personally have not read the whole thing, so I can't give my 100% take on it, but that's something considered if you're interested in archaeology in New Jersey. And so I want to say thank you. My email's there, but I'm going to stop sharing now and talk a little bit more, and then we'll kind of enter the Q&A period if anyone has any questions. Okay, and so I know I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to type or formulate their thoughts. I never want to rush anybody into doing so.
All right, looks like first and foremost, Taylor, that was awesome. A lot of really interesting information about the local tribes here, and lot of great photos. That video of the shell mound or the midden was really, really cool too. Did you do that drone footage?
No, I am nowhere
Okay.
skilled to do that. But I happened to found it, and I have the YouTube link in the presentation if anybody
Okay.
wants a copy of that.
Perfect. Yeah, that'd be great because it is a longer video. So if you want to check that out a little bit more, you can. There is a question in the chat. Does your work assist or support current Lenape as they are still an active Indigenous group in New Jersey? That's a good question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of this research was based on some work that Paul talked about a little bit that I did in undergrad. I just recently graduated my bachelor's in spring of 2021. So I was doing that through Stockton University under a foundation type of grant. And so while I was doing that work, at the end, I hosted a dialogue and reflection session, is what we call them at Stockton. And so there, first and foremost, we had a representative from the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation. She was gracious enough to attend and explain to it. We want to make sure that like any type of research that we were conducting at the university was like, it was definitely informed by the tribal nation themselves. And so that's sort of assisting and supporting and giving a bit of a platform through the university to a lot of students that honestly are not informed about like local history, or if they're not from, the South Jersey area and they're coming to the university.
Okay, great. Next question. Are there Lenape in other states besides the East Coast?
Oh, that's a good one. So a lot of my very rudimentary knowledge is focused in this area, Southern Richland County, Lenape County, South Jersey. But from what I've gathered, there is a population of Lenape over in Oklahoma. And so that, of course, was from a lot of Indigenous people being forcibly displaced throughout colonization efforts. And so today there's a decent population over in Oklahoma.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Okay. I'll give anyone a chance to either come off mute or add another question in the chat. I actually have one for you too, Taylor. So at the Jacques Cousteau Reserve, we're always, one of the things that we're always looking into and keeping an eye on are flooding and rising seas in and around New Jersey coastal towns, the Bay right here. So do you know if flooding is impacting the midden, and if so, how? Is that one of the reasons why it's sort of getting smaller, or so do you know if there are any flooding impacts is impacting that mound in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as I'm aware, I've seen it referenced in certain papers, but more so about like the sea level. A lot of like scholars were arguing over what the exact heights were at certain times throughout the centuries that this midden's been existing. And so that, of course, would play a role in, how does it, stay throughout the years? What shifts about it? As far as I've read, it's declined in size pretty considerably, but it's still considered like the largest, if not, they say it's the largest in the New Jersey area, but people sometimes try to say that it's one of the largest in the East Coast. So I'm not quite sure how flooding may play a role in it in the future, especially with things like global warming. So I would think so. I think it's definitely something to consider. How do we protect these? Because I know that whole area is protected and it's prohibited from walking. Like you can't just visit the midden, besides it being dangerous to walk on the marsh, of course.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a good point to make. You can see it from the road, right? But you can't.
Yes, my photos from the road. You can see perfectly fine. Please don't wander into the marsh. I could only imagine. Oh God.
The comment about Life on the Edge drones takes beautiful footage of J. Senior and Tuckerton. Agreed. The beautiful, beautiful scenery. That might have reminded me of Life on the Edge drones, or might have been, you know, who filmed that. I'm not really sure. I didn't look at the YouTube link carefully, but okay. Any other comments, questions for Taylor today? Oh, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out today and Zooming with us. I know I mentioned a little bit about my, okay.
No, I was just going to say thank you, Taylor, for presenting today. We have a lot of other good thank yous and comments in the chat as we sign off. So thank you again for doing this presentation for us. Did you want to share any other emails or links in the chat before you go?
Sure, I'll type my email in the chat. It's my last name, Ketchum, Ketchamt at go.stockton.edu. And so if anyone's interested in anything like that, I know Paul mentioned a little bit about the digital exhibit that I was working on as a result of this research. Like any digital exhibit, it's growing and changing and evolving. So the link right now on the Stockton University archive website is down, but eventually it'll be up there if you take a look in a couple of weeks. Right now they're in the middle of 50th anniversary celebrations for the institution. So
excellent. Yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on that. So great. Well, thanks again. That's it for our Lunch and Learn for today. Thank you again, Taylor. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.